All right, Ryan, what's on your radar this morning?
Well, Russia announced this week that it was halting its Nord Stream 1 pipeline to Europe, cutting off its gas supply and sending energy markets haywire. His stated reason was that sanctions have prevented them from doing the required maintenance necessary to keep the gas flowing. Now, the German company involved with operating the pipeline says that this simply isn't true and that a cutoff wasn't necessary. Putin is making the point that if the West wants Russian gas, they're going to have to relieve some of the sanctions. And the dispute puts both sides in an odd spot rhetorically. After all, the purpose of the sanctions is to damage Russian industry, particularly its war-making industry, in part by making it difficult to get replacement parts for its manufacturing sector. Now, Putin is certainly exaggerating and is shutting the pipeline down as a power play, but the Western goal is indeed to shut down Russian industry. Meanwhile, Russia now occupies Europe's largest nuclear power plant, which is inside Ukraine's borders, and fighting is raging all around it, risking a meltdown of biblical proportions. From the historic heat wave in California to the unspeakably devastating flooding in Pakistan, extreme weather events fueled by climate change are now all around us. It's a good time to think about what the future of energy looks like. And that brings us to a viral thread posted this week by online conservative Michael Schellenberg. Now, because I've spent the last year on this show earnestly going back and forth about politics and policy in a good faith manner with people I often disagree with, I stupidly thought I could do the same thing on Twitter.com. Now, because Schellenberger really does make some points in this thread that anybody concerned with energy or the climate has to think seriously about. And I'll get to those in a minute, but his basic argument is that renewables require too much land, aren't efficient enough, and use too many rare earth materials, which, as you can guess by the name, are kind of rare. Those are reasonable points to make, but it's easier to point to the limitations of a potential solution than it is to propose your own solution. So I asked him this: so what's your plan here if you were in charge? Shut down all renewables and focus on carbon tech and burn fossil fuels until what? So pretend that you can sequester all carbon. You still have the problem of a finite supply of fossil fuels. What do you do in 2090? To which he said, I see you still can't be bothered to read. Okay, so I promise I'll get to some real substance here in a minute, but indulge me for a second because it's awfully satisfying when somebody online comes at you with a full blast of condescension and then winds up stepping on a rake, which is what happened next. So I flagged what I thought was a contradiction in his argument, namely that while it's true we don't have enough rare earth minerals, we also don't have endless amounts of natural gas or uranium. He came back with more condescension. Have you ever considered reading, he asked. And to make it easier for me, he included his key passage, which reads, quote, the proven U.S. and Canadian reserves of natural gas are 473 trillion cubic feet and 83 trillion cubic feet, respectively. That means North America could produce enough for itself and Europe for over 1,000 years. Not that we would need to. We should and likely will move to nuclear energy long before then, unquote. 1,000 years, that's a lot of time. If that were true, that would be a really strong answer to what I had posed to him. Now, because the data I had posted, which came from the U.S. Energy Information Administration, put the timeline at roughly 98 years, I asked him for some more details here. If it's 1,000 years, that's great. We're in good shape, aside from the climate implications. But if it's just 100 years, that's actually not so great. So let's do the math. The US and Canada collectively are producing about 40 trillion cubic feet of natural gas per year, a bit over 30 in the US and 7-ish in Canada. You can look those numbers up. Schellenberger says in his Substack, we're sitting on 473 trillion proven reserves here, plus 83 trillion in Canada, which is 556 trillion cubic feet. I don't understand why he throws in Europe as a place we can also cover, but let's leave them out for the calculations to help Schellenberger out. So 556 divided by 40 is 13.9. So we have enough natural gas in proved reserves, according to Schellenberg's own numbers, to last almost 14 years. So I flagged this for him, and after he'd replied about half a dozen times to me, he went dark and simply deleted his condescending tweet. But he never let his readers know that his entire alternative proposal, as it related to natural gas, that we don't need to transition to renewables because we have 1,000 years of gas, was based on his bad math. Now, to be extra generous to him, if we also include unproved reserves, which means gas that we know exists but is too costly to drill under these current economic conditions, adding in those reserves will get you closer to 100 years, which is better than 14 but nowhere near 1,000. This matters because the problems we're facing are real ones. And Schellenberger's point that the current technology is not up to the challenge given the resource limitations is a fair one. And so the question we all need to ask is, what do we do about that? His answer, just bask in our 1,000 years of natural gas while we smoothly transition to nuclear, is just lulling you to sleep with a lie. We don't have that amount of time. We have to start figuring this out now. Now, when it comes to nuclear, Schellenberger would surely acknowledge the current limitations. It takes years and billions in subsidies to launch a plant. We have a limited amount of uranium. Many parts of the globe are far too corrupt and unstable to safely run a nuclear power plant. And that's before we worry about regional wars. We have no solution to the proliferating problem of nuclear waste, which becomes that much more extreme if you add another few thousand nuclear plants to the planet. But he hopes that with enough investment and scientific innovation, we can solve for all of those problems and then transition from natural gas to nuclear. Okay. But when it comes to clean energy, he won't allow any of that optimism. What you have right now at the infancy of the industry is what you'll get. That's it. There'll be no serious progress, no breakthroughs, no hope we can solve for those challenges. Yet somehow, this same society is going to crack the nuclear code. And while he ignores the limited amount of uranium on Earth, he warns that we'll run out of minerals needed for clean energy. And like I said, I think he's right. We should be concerned about that. And one thing we need to do is encourage research into battery technology, for instance, that can recycle old materials or that uses materials that are more abundant. And maybe he agrees with that, but our exchange never got there. It's just one more tragedy of the public square that has just become a boxing ring, because he made other useful points, like this one, talking about the dominance that China has on the renewable industry. These are points that are really worth engaging with. And Emily, you probably remember I've done, I think, multiple radars on how how China has very strategically locked down a monopoly on producing a lot of clean energy parts. And when the Biden administration tried to move just subtly against them, they shut down imports and bought off a lobbying firm here in Washington to fire back at it. So he's right that that's a problem, and you need kind of I think a cross-party, trans-ideological pushback to say, no, like, yeah, this is true. This is a problem, but we need to solve for these problems, not pretend that we can just, pump gas for 1,000 years and that nuclear is going to solve the problem.
Yeah, and I like Michael. I'm a fan of his, so I won't come between this. But
He's a half friend of the show.
I will say that the point you end on there is really interesting because it gets to the heart of, I think, our problem in general, which is that even with renewables, we're reliant on, in some cases, I think some of the same rare earth minerals to make the technology, to make the technology that captures the energy from renewable sources. Mm-hmm. So even if we find a way to harness wind or solar power, to your point, in a way that's like competitive with nuclear, because this is a technology, these technologies are at their infancy, right? We know it's still not a very predictable source of energy, but maybe there's a way to make it more efficient and store up more of it. To your point, then at some juncture, there's still a finite amount of resources on Earth. And so we need to figure out a way to be sort of, first of all, self-sustaining. We need to figure out ways to do this harmoniously. The nuclear plant in Ukraine is an extremely good example of that. The Nord Stream 2 pipeline is an extremely good example of that. So we want to think that we've reached the end of history. That's not a dig at Fukuyama, who's meant something different than a lot of people think. But we wanted to say that if we all westernized and democratized, we would feel much more comfortable. The Cold War is over, the new future is here, but in fact, we're going to be having some of the very same wars over resources that we've had for time immemorial, because there's a finite amount of these things, and to your point, feels like we're locked into a battle instead of making huge progress towards harnessing energy in different ways. Right,
and if you look at France, which was heavily dependent on nuclear and remains, and which had one of the greatest kind of carbon reductions in its footprint in history because of nuclear. Give them credit for that. The rivers are now running dry that are needed to cool the nuclear power plants. And so if you're not grappling with climate change at the same time that you're doing this, not only do you have the problems of regional wars, Because if you want to power the entire world with nuclear power, that's going to take 2,000 plus nuclear power plants. So you're going to have wars near these power plants.
Right.
And Chernobyl, there's a 1,600 square mile area around Chernobyl that is still uninhabitable to this day. And so if we have a meltdown at this plant in Ukraine, which seems possible at any minute at this point, that's a massive portion of Europe that is just uninhabitable for could be centuries, as far as we know. How many of those accidents can we afford? And if we have 2,000 of these, and also go ahead and spin the globe and stop it and point at a bunch of different countries and ask yourself if you feel like those countries have the regulatory regime in place that they'd be able to actually inspect these power plants. Because if a solar installation has a problem, you might get a little fire. Nuclear power plant has some wiring off, much bigger problem.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think what's interesting in that is we both agree that there's these very serious problems of finite resources. I'm on there's just incredible contrast in what we think about doing it in the moment. I'm in the position, don't curb human flourishing, human prosperity, and don't curb fossil fuel use unnecessarily until we have enough time to allow people to live their lives. But on the other hand, what you're highlighting is what's up?
You're in the mansion camp.
Not quite. But what you're highlighting is the urgency, which I completely agree with. The urgency is, manifest in ways that we don't like to think about, and it goes beyond just the sort of hippie Ryan Grimm issues that people might think about. It's foreign policy. It's finite resources, period, and that's something that we sort of feel superhuman. We solved the problem of finite resources, right? In the Industrial Revolution, we're nowhere near out of the woods.
Yeah, not at all. Stuff ain't a joke. Anyway, looking forward to seeing your radar up next.